Do you know what betrayal feels like? It's not a knife in the back. It's your own daughter smiling while the doctors drag you into a psych ward, and her husband toasting champagne in the house you once called home. That was my reality. My name is Mary, and I'll never forget the day I realized that the two people I trusted most in this world had decided I was more valuable, locked away, than standing on my own 2 feet. I can still hear the squeak of those gurney wheels against the linoleum floor, the way the restraints bit into my skin as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Nurses whispered words like delusional and unstable, while I screamed that I wasn't sick, I wasn't crazy, but none of them listened, because on the intake papers, right under next of kin, was my daughter's signature, Anna, my flesh and blood, my baby girl, the one I raised after losing my husband far too soon. And behind it all, I knew her husband Ben was smiling, already dreaming of what he'd do with the mountain house my late husband and I had built together. That house wasn't just wood and stone. It was every memory I had left of him. Every laugh by the fireplace, every birthday dinner, every storm we weathered together while the roof rattled and the windows howled. And when he died, I clung to that house like a lifeline. I thought Anna understood that. I thought she cherished it too. But the truth is, I was blind. Grief makes fools of us all. The first night in that ward was the longest of my life. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the hum of fluorescent lights above me, the air stale with disinfectant. My mind spun in circles. How could Anna do this to me? What story had she told the doctors? That I was depressed? Unstable? A danger to myself? I remembered the way she'd put her hand on mine a week earlier, eyes soft and voice dripping with concern. "Mom, you've been so forgetful lately. Maybe some rest would do you good. Ben and I can handle things for a while." I thought she was helping. I thought she cared. I never imagined that while I was locked behind those doors, she'd be throwing parties in my home, claiming my husband's legacy as her own. And yes, I heard about it. You'd be surprised what orderlies will tell you when they think you're too sedated to remember. One of them, a kind young man named Victor, leaned down as he tucked a blanket around me one night and whispered, "Your daughter had people over at the mountain house. Big party. Looked like a celebration." My blood ran cold. I could almost see it. The living room I once decorated for Christmas, now filled with strangers laughing, glasses clinking, Anna twirling in the center of it all like she was queen of the castle. My castle. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I'd been drowning in grief, yes, but betrayal like that doesn't just cut you, it hardens you. As I lay there in that sterile bed, I stopped crying, I stopped begging, and I whispered to myself, if they think I'm broken, then I'll let them believe it, but I'll make them regret underestimating me. So, I played the part. I kept my head down, I answered questions slowly, let my hands tremble just enough to look fragile, and while I pretended to be the patient they wanted me to be, I listened, I learned. I studied the doctors, the therapy sessions, the way they measured sanity and insanity. They thought they were breaking me down, but I was building myself back up, piece by piece, with sharper edges than before. Months passed. By the time they finally released me, I wasn't the same woman who walked in. I had nothing left. My house, my belongings, even my reputation had been stripped away. When I showed up at the mountain home, suitcase in hand, my daughter opened the door, leaning against the frame like I was some unwelcome guest. Ben stood behind her, smirking. "Mom," Anna said, her voice cold and clipped, "this place is ours now. Dad would have wanted it this way. You need to move on."
Her words sliced deeper than any knife. Dad would have wanted this? My husband, who spent every waking hour making sure I was safe, who built that house as a fortress of love and family, he would never have wanted me tossed aside like garbage. But I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply smiled faintly, turned my back, and walked away. Because in that moment, I knew the truth. Rage wouldn't save me. Only patience would. Years went by. I scraped together a life, small and quiet, working odd jobs, living in a modest rental. But every night, when the world was still, I thought of that house, of Anna's smug little smile, of Ben's greedy eyes scanning the land like a vulture. And each time, my resolve grew stronger. I didn't just want revenge, I needed it. So I studied. I enrolled in classes, psychology, counseling, therapy. People thought I was healing, reinventing myself. In reality, I was arming myself with knowledge. I devoured textbooks on human behavior, manipulation, trauma. I learned the language of the very people who once decided I was unfit. Slowly, I climbed. And when I finally earned my license, standing on that stage with certificate in hand, I felt it in my bones. The tables had turned. Then came the call. Crisp autumn morning, leaves falling outside my window, a voice from the county court asking if I was available to take on a new family therapy case. I almost dropped the phone when I heard the names, Anna and Ben. My daughter, her husband. Court-ordered therapy. And the therapist assigned to them? Me. Tell me, what would you have done if you were me? Would you have turned it down, fearing the old wounds? Or would you have smiled, the way I did, knowing fate had just delivered your enemies into your hands? The day Anna and Ben first walked into my office, I had to dig my nails into the underside of my desk just to keep my face calm. Years of preparation had brought me here, to this single moment, and I couldn't afford to let the mask slip. The door opened and in they came. Older, maybe a little worn down, but still carrying that air of smug entitlement. Anna wore an expensive coat, her hair styled just so, and her eyes darted around my office like she was assessing whether I was worthy of her presence. Ben trailed behind her, broad-shouldered, carrying that same arrogant smirk he'd worn the day they shut the door of my home in my face. They didn't recognize me at first. Why would they? I was dressed professionally, my hair neatly pulled back, glasses perched on my nose. I wasn't the broken woman they left behind years ago. I was someone new, someone they never imagined I could become. "Dr. Carter?" Anna asked, her voice carefully polite. "We're the Hendersons. The court told us you'd be handling our sessions." I smiled, calm and measured, extending my hand. "Yes, welcome. Please have a seat." My voice didn't tremble, though my heart was hammering so loudly I thought they might hear it. As they settled onto the couch across from me, I studied them with the same detached focus I'd been trained to use on any client. But inside, I was a storm. This was my daughter, my only child, and she was looking right at me without a flicker of recognition. That stung more than I expected. Years of distance, years of betrayal, and I had become a stranger to her. Ben leaned back, his arms slung across the couch in that casual, dominating way men like him always do. "So, Doc, how does this work? We just talk about our feelings or whatever until the court gets off our back?" He laughed, and Anna gave him a sharp look, clearly embarrassed. I folded my hands in my lap and said smoothly, "Something like that, but I don't just want you to talk. I want to understand what brought you here, and more importantly, what's been festering between you. Because if the court thinks you need intervention, there's usually a reason." Anna sighed, crossing her legs. "It's complicated. We've been struggling. Communication issues, disagreements about money, about family. You know how it is." Family. The word nearly made me laugh. She spoke it so easily, as if she hadn't discarded me like trash to get her hands on my home. I had to bite down on the inside of my cheek to keep from snapping back. Instead, I nodded. "Go on." Ben snorted. "She's leaving out the part where she spends money like water. New cars, shopping trips, renovations, always trying to make that house bigger, better, but it's never enough." That house. My husband's sweat and blood in every beam and nail. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Maybe greed was finally eating them alive.
Anna turned sharply to him. I've built a life for us, Ben. I'm not going to live like some recluse in the woods. That house needs to reflect who we are now. Their voices began to rise, tension crackling between them, and I sat back, letting it play out. This was better than I could have hoped. They weren't a united front, they were cracking, splitting at the seams. And all I had to do was gently widen those cracks until the whole foundation came crumbling down. I cleared my throat softly, and both their heads snapped toward me. It sounds like there's a lot of resentment building on both sides, I said carefully. Anna, you feel unappreciated for what you've tried to create. Ben, you feel overwhelmed by the financial pressure. Both of you want control in different ways. Does that sound accurate? They exchanged glances, reluctantly nodding. Good, I said, scribbling a note on my clipboard. But the note wasn't about their marriage. It was about my plan. Step 1, get them talking. Step 2, get them unraveling. Step 3, well, that would come later. As the session went on, I began weaving subtle threads, questions that seemed harmless but pressed on tender bruises. Anna, when you talk about the house, do you feel it represents your independence, or is it more about proving something to others? I asked. She stiffened, defensive. It's about both, she admitted. I don't want people to think I'm some small-town girl who never made it. Ben rolled his eyes. There it is. Everything's about appearances with you. I turned to him, voice calm. And for you, Ben, when you push back on the spending, is it just about money, or do you feel overshadowed in some way? His jaw clenched. She doesn't listen to me. It's always her way, like I don't matter. They were biting at each other's throats, and all I had to do was sit there, nodding, jotting down notes. Outwardly, I was the picture of professional composure. Inside, though, I was savoring every second. These two had stolen everything from me. And now, here they were, paying me to slowly, methodically tear them apart. At the end of the session, I smiled warmly. You both did well today. This is just the beginning. We'll meet weekly, and over time, I believe we can get to the heart of these issues. They left the office in silence, tension hanging heavy between them. I watched from the window as they walked to their car, Anna's arms folded tightly, Ben muttering something under his breath. I could see it already. The tiny fractures that would grow wider with each session. When they drove off, I sank into my chair, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from exhilaration. The game had begun. Tell me, if you were me, would you have gone easy on them, or would you have done what I did? Smile sweetly, play the professional, while plotting their downfall with every word they spoke. After that first meeting, I spent the weekend mapping everything in my head like a general planning a siege. Their arguments, the little tells they couldn't hide, the way Ben's mouth tightened when money was mentioned, the shadow of shame that crossed Anna's face when I asked about how she felt seen. Those were the hinges I intended to pry open. A marriage, especially one built on convenience and entitlement rather than genuine devotion, has weak boards. You press at the right place, and the whole thing splinters. The next session, I arrived with a calm I had cultivated like armor. I greeted them, offered tea, and watched them settle into their usual positions. Habit is a comfort, and people carry their comfort into the room like a shield. That's why therapists learn to notice what's not said as much as what is. I let silence do a lot of the work. I asked fewer questions aloud and let their conversation drift until it snagged on something vulnerable. Anna, softly after a long pause, tell me about a time you felt truly happy in that house. Her eyes softened for a beat and the memory came. A childhood birthday, candles, laughter. For a moment, she looked like my daughter again, small and real. Then the moment passed and her face hardened. That was a different life, she said. Things are complicated now. Complicated, of course, was a polite word for regret and self-justification. I began to plant seeds with the gentlest of nudges. Nothing dramatic, no accusations. I asked about their finances in a clinical, innocuous way. The court had mandated transparency, after all. Ben answered curtly, gave numbers, shrugged. But numbers tell stories. I pretended to be surprised by innocuous things. Mentions of loans, renovations, unexplained transfers. You'd be amazed how quickly arrogance turns to defensiveness when you shine the light on the ledger. When Ben left the room to take a call, I turned to Anna and lowered my voice. I built a lot of your identity around that house. Is there even space left for you outside of it? Her lip curled. What do you mean? She asked, but the edge in her voice gave me what I wanted. An opening. Sometimes when people throw themselves into maintaining appearances, it's because something else is missing. Maybe intimacy. Maybe respect. Have you ever felt unseen by Ben? It was like dropping a stone into stagnant water. The ripples went everywhere. She blinked quickly, fighting the response, then let out a breath that smelled of regret. He never takes me seriously, she admitted. He always makes me feel like I'm frivolous or reckless. The admission was small, but it was a wedge. Over the following weeks, I smoothed the surface while sharpening the underneath. I assigned exercises that, on the surface, were standard. Communication logs, I statements, times when each of them had to express gratitude. But each exercise had a tactical aim. When I asked them to write down what they spent money on each month, I saw Anna's hand tremble as she labeled purchases necessary. When I asked Ben to describe a moment he'd felt proud of Anna, his answer was stilted, perfunctory. They were incapable of speaking each other's language without flinching. I also pulled on threads from their past. People always underestimate how much past humiliation informs present cruelty. In one session, I invited them to talk about their parents, their childhoods, the models of love they grew up with. Ben's father had been the kind of man who equated status with self-worth. Anna's mother, my daughter's mother, had been distant after my husband died, and Anna had been forced to grow up fast. These small biographical nudges made their present ugliness make more sense. Ben's insistence on looking successful and Anna's hunger to be acknowledged weren't random, they were echoes. Between sessions, I did the less clinical work. I learned where they shopped, which cafes they favored, who Anna texted late at night. A therapist must respect boundaries, yes, but they also must understand a family's ecosystem if they're to treat it. I was careful, of course. Ethical lines are one thing and strategy another. I never lied about being a therapist. The court record said so. But there are legal and practical gray areas in human relations, and I stepped into those shadows like a cat slipping through moonlit alleys. One evening, after a tense session where Ben accused Anna of, quote, wasting our money on sentimental nonsense, Anna left the room in tears. Ben stayed for a brief moment and then, as if impulsively, reached for his phone. He scrolled, thumb idly tapping, and then the old arrogance returned. He didn't notice when I caught his screen at an angle. A brochure for luxury cabins in a resort a few towns over. High-end finishes, a price that would make most people gasp. He was planning to sell off parcels to monetize the land they inherited. Exactly what I'd feared. That night, I couldn't sleep. But not for anger. Excitement, more like. The play was unfolding exactly as it should. Their squabbles were not small domestic matters. They were financial decisions that would leave fingerprints. Fingerprints could be followed. Follow the money, as people always say. I began to make contact. Discreet inquiries about property tax changes, public records searches, small, perfectly legal checks that gave me a bigger picture of what they were doing to the estate. And in the office, I leaned into the delicate art of disclosure. I'd ask a question that seemed purely therapeutic and then watch them reveal something they didn't mean to. Anna, I would say softly, what would you do if someone told you that the house could be a liability instead of an asset? Her eyes would flash with fear. "I'd never let that happen," she'd say, sharp and immediate. And then she'd drop a detail. A bank name, a contractor, the name of a friend who was handling the sale. It was like pulling out a thread and finding an entire seam. Of course, there were risks. You don't toy with people who have robbed you without rolling the dice. I had to be careful not to become the kind of person who wallows in revenge for its own sake. That was the trap I had watched my daughter and son-in-law fall into. Entitlement that blindfolded them to consequences. My aim wasn't cruelty. It was justice, measured and precise. Every tactic I used was to expose, to force them to feel the ripple of the choices they made. I wanted them to see themselves clearly, and I wanted the law to notice too. One particularly cold afternoon, we were doing an exercise about accountability. I asked them to name one thing they could change that week to be better partners. Ben answered with a snide remark, and Anna, already raw, snapped back. Their argument escalated into slurs and barbs that would have made anyone uncomfortable. I waited until the climax of the shouting, and then, without drama, I said, "I will be documenting this session in full, including your financial disclosures. I'm required to report anything that affects the well-being of the family members involved." Their faces shifted. Suddenly, the theater of their cruelty looked smaller, more exposed. As they left, Anna cast a look back that was equal parts hatred and something I recognized as fear. Maybe she had finally realized she wasn't playing with a broken woman she could ignore. Maybe she had glimpsed the cost of what she had done. Or maybe she was just imagining how hard it would be to maintain the lie now that a trained professional had begun to pry. Either way, I was gaining ground. The slow, quiet work of therapy had become my instrument. I wasn't a vengeful monster. I was a patient artisan, using knowledge and law and a little bit of human psychology to peel back the layers until their ugly core was raw and visible. When people underestimate you, they show you everything. And Anna and Ben had shown me plenty. By the 4th month of sessions, the cracks were no longer hairline fractures, they were chasms. Anna came into the office more often with that clipped tone of someone holding back tears, while Ben sat heavy in a seat, his arrogance fraying at the edges. They were unraveling, and I was the one tugging at every loose thread. But if therapy was the scalpel, the real surgery was happening outside the office, in the quiet hours when I combed through records and pieced together the financial story they thought no one would ever uncover. I knew where to look because I had lived in that house. I knew the land, the boundaries, the value hidden in the acres of timber and rock. And when I began tracing property transfers, tax filings, and the sudden appearance of loans in Ben's name, the picture sharpened. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate. They had mortgaged the land, leveraged it to the hilt, and were living like royalty while the foundation beneath them was crumbling. One night, sitting at my kitchen table with paper spread across the wood, I saw it clearly. If they couldn't make their payments, the bank would come calling. And when the bank came calling, all their dirty secrets would tumble out. But I didn't want them ruined by chance. I wanted them ruined by truth.
So I began dropping subtle questions during sessions. Ben, you mentioned feeling overwhelmed financially, I'd say, my voice even curious. Do you think the choices you've made with the property have contributed to that stress? His jaw would clench, his eyes dart toward Anna, and he'd mutter something about short-term setbacks. Anna would then jump in defensively, accusing him of mismanaging, overspending, failing to provide stability. They tore at each other like animals. And I wrote it all down, Every word, every admission, every flash of guilt that passed between them. Still, revenge is a dangerous business. One slip, one wrong word, and I could lose everything I'd built. That reality came crashing into me one Friday afternoon when Anna stayed behind after Ben stormed out of the session. She lingered by the door, her coat half on, eyes darting toward me like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she dared. "Dr. Carter, do I know you from somewhere?" For one heart-stopping moment, I froze. My blood turned to ice, but my face didn't move. I forced a gentle smile. "It's possible," I said calmly. "I've lived in the area a long time. Maybe you've seen me around." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. For a heartbeat, I thought the game was over, that she'd finally peel back the mask and recognize the woman she once betrayed. But then she shook her head, muttering, "No, never mind. Forget I said anything." She left, the door clicking softly behind her. I sat in my chair for a long time afterward, my breath shallow, my palms damped with sweat. That had been too close, far too close. But it also lit a fire under me. Close calls meant the end game was approaching, and if Anna was starting to sense the weight of familiarity, then I needed to move faster. That weekend, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to sit back and let their marriage rot from within. I was going to bring in outside pressure, a weight they couldn't shrug off. The law had put me in their lives, and the law could take far more from them than I ever could alone. So I began compiling a file. Every financial irregularity, every reckless confession, every sign that their home wasn't a home at all, but a collapsing house of cards. I cross-referenced their deaths with county records, highlighted contradictions in their statements, and built a case that spoke louder than emotion ever could. A case of neglect, mismanagement, possible fraud. But the sweetest part? I didn't have to fabricate a single thing. They'd done it all to themselves. I was simply arranging the puzzle pieces so the picture was undeniable. Back in session, I kept up the role of the calm, impartial therapist. I nodded when Anna broke down crying about feeling trapped. I listened when Ben ranted about being unappreciated. But underneath it all, I was pressing, nudging, steering them into admitting more, into handing me the very rope they'd used to hang themselves. One session stands out, a moment burned into my memory. I asked them both to imagine what their lives would look like 5 years from now if nothing changed. Ben scoffed. "We'd still be in that damn house, drowning in bills." Anna snapped back, "At least we'd still have the house unless you screw it up like everything else." Silence followed, a silence so heavy you could feel it pressing on your chest. I leaned in slightly and said, almost in a whisper, "It sounds like the house isn't a home to either of you anymore. It sounds like it's a battlefield." Their eyes met then. Not with love, not with understanding, but something closer to hatred, and I knew in that moment I had won another small victory. But small victories weren't enough, not yet. I wanted the collapse to be public, undeniable, the kind of downfall people whispered about for years. And with the file I was building, with every admission they gave me, I was inching closer. Do you see where I was going with this? Tell me honestly, would you have pushed this far, or would you have backed off after that close call with Anna? Because me? I wasn't backing off, not after everything they had stolen. The day I decided to weaponize the file, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. For so long, Anna and Ben had painted me as powerless, a frail woman tucked away in a ward, my voice drowned out by their signatures in their lies. But now, each page in my folder, each note in my careful handwriting, each confession recorded in those therapy sessions, they were power, and I intended to use them. I didn't start with a bang. No, revenge is most effective when it begins with whispers. So I reached out to a colleague, a family lawyer I trusted, under the guise of seeking advice for a case. I laid out the financial irregularities, the reckless loans, the questionable transfers. He frowned, tapping his pen on the desk. This looks messy. If the wrong person saw this, they'd be in serious trouble. Exactly. The next step was subtler. I sent an anonymous tip to the bank that held their mortgage, hinting at possible fraudulent transfers tied to the property. Nothing explicit, just enough to raise eyebrows. Within weeks, Anna and Ben started arriving to sessions with dark circles under their eyes, their conversations laced with panic about letters they'd received, calls they couldn't avoid.
I sat there, nodding like the compassionate therapist, when really I was biting the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. But I wasn't done. I needed to turn the screws tighter. So I started planting little seeds in Anna's mind, questions designed to grow into doubt. Do you feel Ben is fully transparent with you about finances? I'd ask. She'd glance sideways at him, suspicion flashing across her face. And to Ben, I'd say, do you feel Anna supports your decisions, or do you sense resistance? He'd bristle, muttering about how she never understands the pressure he's under. They left each session raw, frayed, convinced the other was the enemy. And each week, they unraveled a little more. Still, revenge isn't about speed. It's about patience. And patience meant watching them struggle, then carefully nudging them toward choices that would accelerate their downfall. One afternoon, after a particularly heated session where Anna accused Ben of hiding bills from her, I dropped a line that seemed innocent at the time. Sometimes, I said, voice steady, a spouse's silence can be more dangerous than their anger. Silence leaves room for secrets. That night, Anna stormed into their shared session late, mascara streaked, cheeks blotched from crying. She'd gone through his desk. She'd found unpaid notices, second mortgages, debts she had no idea existed. And for the first time, she turned her rage on me. "You're making us worse," she shouted, standing in the middle of my office. "All you do is pick at us, make us doubt each other. You're supposed to help, not—" She trailed off, clutching her chest like the weight of her own words was too much. I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "Anna, I don't create the problems. I just reveal the ones already there. What you do with that truth is up to you." She sank into the chair, trembling. Ben sat with his arms crossed, glaring at me like he suspected I'd orchestrated the whole thing. He wasn't wrong. But here's the beauty. They couldn't run. The court had ordered these sessions. They had to sit in front of me week after week as I dismantled their fragile alliance piece by piece. Outside those sessions, my quiet campaign grew. I forwarded key documents, again anonymously, to a local journalist known for sniffing out corruption. Nothing explosive, just enough to put the scent in the air. And I knew, sooner or later, that scent would draw attention. By the end of that month, Anna was showing up late, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling from too much coffee or too little sleep. Ben looked thinner, his bravado cracked, snapping at her in front of me with no attempt to hide it. They weren't a team anymore. They were two people caught in a crumbling house, each trying to hold the roof up while blaming the other for the storm. I should have felt guilty, maybe. After all, these were my daughter and her husband, blood and family, at least by definition. But when I thought of that cold night years ago, when I lay in that psych ward bed with their signatures trapping me there, the guilt evaporated. They had chosen greed over love, power over loyalty, and now I was choosing truth over mercy. But still, revenge is a delicate dance. Push too far, too fast, and the prey bolts. Push too softly, and they recover. I needed the perfect balance. I needed them not just broken, but exposed. And the moment to deliver that exposure was coming closer. Every panic-filled session, every crack in their marriage, every anonymous ripple I sent into their world, it was all building towards something bigger. The question wasn't if they'd collapse. It was when. and whether I'd be ready to strike at the exact moment their house of lies finally toppled. Tell me, what would you have done? Would you have stopped at watching them turn on each other, or would you have pushed forward knowing the real satisfaction only comes when the whole world sees the truth? A week after I slipped the files to the reporter, I began to see the first ripples. It started small, a terse phone call from a clerk at the county office asking whether I'd noticed discrepancies in the public records. A quiet knock on my neighbor's door with questions about people who'd been seen on the property. I could have felt nervous. Instead, a strange, steady calm settled in my bones. The machinery I'd set in motion was starting to hum. The journalist, a wiry woman named Dana, who wrote for the local paper, called me under the pretense of following up on a tip. Her voice was brisk, professional. "There's something messy going on with the Henderson property," as she said. "We've had a few anonymous reports. Maybe you know a thing or two." I let the silence hang. A therapist's silence can be as useful as a legal brief. "I might," I answered, and I could feel her interest sharpen through the phone. "If you're writing, be careful. Some people don't like their private life becoming public." She laughed, the sound sharp and hungry. "Neither do the guilty," she said. From then on, Dana's questions became more frequent and pointed. She started showing up at community meetings, making casual inquiries to contractors, and asking pointed questions of county clerks. Her reporting smelled like trouble for Anna and Ben, and I could almost taste their panic through the thin barrier of paper and polite conversation. The authorities followed, as they tend to do, when enough curious eyes align. A quiet investigator from the county tax office called me, requesting a meeting. He was polite, unassuming, the kind of man who wore his doubts like a coat. I handed him the photocopies I'd compiled, the notes from sessions where Ben admitted to taking out loans, the timeline of transfers. He frowned, running a thumb along a highlighted line, eyes narrowing. "This could warrant a deeper look," he said, "but we'd need more than hearsay." I slid him the rest of the file, the parts where they'd spoken offhandedly about contractors, about short-term fixes in liquidating parcels. He glanced up at me, a respectful curiosity in his gaze. "You understand how serious this is, Dr. Carter?" he asked. I nodded. "I do. That's why I brought it to you."
Word spread like wildfire in a small town when the scent of scandal touches the air. Neighbors started whispering. Friends I barely knew sent me sympathetic messages. Anna and Ben, once a picture of polished success on the hill, found themselves receiving cold stares at church and thin smiles at the grocery store. Their world was shrinking. The roof that had felt so secure was leaking in places they'd once ignored. In sessions, their defenses crumbled faster now. Ben's answers were clipped. He kept checking his phone. Anna seemed distracted, jittery, always expecting the next shoe to drop. Once, in a moment of terrified candor, she asked me, "What happens if the bank starts foreclosure proceedings?" Her voice was small, collapsing inward. I didn't gloat. That would have been cheap. But I did remind her gently, consequences aren't only financial. They ripple into relationships, into reputations. You have to decide what you value most. She stared at me for a long time after that, as if measuring whether she still valued anything at all. I realized then that the scandal had become a crucible for her. Everything she'd built on appearance was burning away. She either had to choose to mend or let the flames consume her. Outside the therapy room, Dana's stories began to take shape. A short column appeared online with a headline that implied impropriety without naming names. Social media, that modern rumor mill, did the rest. Old classmates and distant cousins reposted, adding their gossip like kindling. Anonymous commenters speculated. Someone unearthed a photo of Anna and Ben hosting a housewarming party on the property, the image captioned with insinuations. The comments were vicious. I read them at night, feeling no triumph, only the cold satisfaction that truth, once nudged into public view, has its own gravity. Then came the subpoena. It was the moment everything became very real. The court wanted records, the bank wanted explanations, Anna and Ben were served. When they came into my office after that, they moved like people walking through mud, each step heavy with dread. "You did this," Ben accused before he sat down, voice raw with accusation. "You sent them something, didn't you? You told that reporter things." His eyes were wild, thrown between fury and fear. Anna sat silently, face ashen. I let my expressions stay neutral. "I don't discuss clients," I said. "But I didn't lie about my involvement in the community, about being worried as anyone would be when a property's irregularities could affect neighbors. They weren't foolish. They'd already begun to suspect. And suspicion, once planted by fear, is quick to become certainty." That night, the town seemed quieter, as if everyone was holding their breath. I walked past the mountain road, glanced up at the silhouette of the house I once called home, and imagined the scenes that were unraveling within. I pictured curl-up sessions in the living room, whispered arguments in the kitchen, the clink of dishes in the sink sounding like the last brittle thread holding them together. For a sliver of a second, I felt a strange, private sadness for the life that could have been, for the child who had once nestled at my shoulder as I baked, for the husband whose tools still sat in a shed somewhere, rusting. And then reality returned with its hard edges. This was not just about nostalgia. It was about justice. It was about showing the world that signatures can be weaponized, that loved ones can betray for profit, and that the law can sometimes do the heavy lifting when morals fail. But the stakes were rising, and with them came new dangers. Ben began showing up to sessions furious, accusing me of manipulating the system. Once, he slammed his fist onto the coffee table, making the cups rattle. "You have no idea what it's like to carry the weight of a mortgage. You think you can just twist things and let us fall?" His face was crimson, his voice edged with something close to desperation. I kept my cool. "I'm not here to ruin you. I'm here to help you see what's happening and give you tools to fix it." He scoffed. "Tools? You don't get it." He stormed out.
That outburst was a gift. Public displays of anger like that, especially when recorded in session notes and witnessed by a licensed professional, are concrete. They are data points that can support investigations, show instability, and reveal character. Every heated moment he'd had was another brick in the case against them. But I knew the line between documenting and entrapment was thin. I had to keep the ethical high ground. If I crossed it, everything would collapse. My license, my credibility, and the fragile justice I'd constructed. So I tightened my approach. More documentation, more careful notes, and a disciplined cadence in sessions where I let them flail but never pushed them into illegal acts. The law would have to do the dirty work I couldn't, and the law was starting to listen. As autumn deepened, the first hearing was scheduled. The town would gather, in force or in whispers, and the Henderson name would be spoken aloud in a way it hadn't been before. Anna and Ben would have to stand under that bright, unforgiving light in answer for choices they'd hoped would never be questioned. I felt the pressure like a physical thing, a coiled rope in my chest. The plan had been long and precise, but no plan survives contact with the world without improvisation. There would be surprises, counters, maybe even attempts to discredit me. I steeled myself. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about holding them accountable in a way that the psych ward never had. Do you feel the tension? If you were sitting in the courtroom, watching the Hendersons' world unravel before you, what would you feel? Vindication? Pity? Or something messier, like sorrow wrapped in justice? The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, that heavy scent of places where too many lives had been unraveled. When I walked into the gallery, papers tucked neatly in my bag, I felt an eerie calm. For years I had been silenced, strapped down, and dismissed. But today, I would not be the voiceless woman in a hospital bed. Today, I was the one holding the file. Anna and Ben were already there, sitting side by side, but leaning away from each other. the distance between them louder than any words. Anna's face was pale, her lipstick smeared at the edges as if she'd applied it in a rush. Ben's jaw was tight, his hands clenched around the table like he was bracing against an invisible storm. The whispering crowd behind them only made it worse. Neighbors, acquaintances, even people from church craned their necks, eager for scandal. Small towns feast on other people's ruin. The proceedings began with routine language, but soon the questions sharpened. Bank representatives spoke first, presenting documents about missed payments, contradictory signatures, and the sudden flurry of loans. Then came the county investigator, calmly outlining irregularities in tax filings, pointing to discrepancies that suggested something more than carelessness. Each word chipped away at the polished facade Anna and Ben had built. I sat quietly, waiting for my turn, my heart beating in a slow, deliberate rhythm. When they finally called me to testify, I rose with measured steps. My license gave my words authority, but my history gave them weight. I spoke as a professional, careful and precise, never letting personal venom seep into my tone. I described the patterns I'd observed in therapy, the admissions Ben and Anna had made under my care, not details that violated confidentiality, but broad strokes that revealed stress, conflict, and inconsistencies in their financial story. Ben exploded. "She's lying!" he shouted, half rising from his chair. The bailiff moved, but the judge's gavel struck hard. "Sit down, Mr. Henderson," the judge ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. Ben's face flushed red, his shoulders shaking. Anna, though, was quieter. She didn't look at me while I spoke. She didn't look at Ben either. Her gaze was fixed on her hands, twisting together in her lap, as though she were finally beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done. Then, just when it seemed the case was tilting entirely in my favor, the defense made their move. Their lawyer, sharp-suited and smooth-voiced, leaned into the microphone. "Your Honor, I find it deeply troubling that the court-appointed therapist in this case has such personal investment. Isn't it true, Dr. Carter, that you are, in fact, Anna's mother?" The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the room. Eyes darted toward me, then to Anna, then back again. I kept my face neutral, but inside my chest tightened. This was the moment I had dreaded. The unmasking. The judge looked at me sternly. "Is that true?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice calm, unwavering. "Anna is my daughter, and Ben is my son-in-law." The murmurs swelled again, the courtroom a restless sea. I raised my chin. "But everything I have presented here today is supported by documents, by their own signatures, and by corroborating witnesses. My relationship to them doesn't change the facts. If anything, it makes their betrayal and their actions all the more undeniable." The judge's eyes narrowed, studying me, weighing the truth of my words. For a long moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he nodded. "The court will take that into consideration. Please proceed." I stepped down, my hands trembling slightly as I returned to my seat. The defense had nearly undone me with a single sentence, and I knew they would use that angle again. But the facts were stronger than blood ties, and I clung to that truth like a lifeline. Afterward, in the hallway, I caught sight of Dana, the journalist, scribbling furiously in her notebook. When she saw me, she lifted her eyebrows, half smiling. "Mother and daughter. That will make one hell of a headline." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because I knew that from this point forward, Anna and Ben's downfall was no longer just a legal battle. It was a public spectacle. Their secrets were no longer theirs. The whole town was watching, whispering, judging. And that was a punishment they couldn't escape. Still, as I drove home that night, headlights sweeping across the mountain road, a sliver of unease lingered. They had nearly turned the tables in that courtroom. Nearly made me the villain. It was a reminder that revenge is never clean, never simple. It's a razor's edge, and one misstep can leave you bleeding instead of your enemy. But I hadn't come this far to falter now. The walls were closing in on them faster and tighter each day, and I intended to make sure they felt every brick pressing down. Be honest, if you had been in that courtroom and your child's betrayal was exposed alongside your revenge, would you have flinched? Or would you have stood as I did, calm and unyielding, letting the world see the truth? After the hearing, life in town changed for Anna and Ben almost overnight. The Henderson name, once whispered with admiration for their apparent success, was now spoken with disdain, often followed by a shake of the head or a muttered curse. I saw it myself in the grocery store one morning. A cashier who once fawned over Anna's designer handbags now rung up her items in cold silence, refusing even to make eye contact. Behind Anna, two women in the checkout line leaned close, whispering with tight smiles. Anna stood stiff as a statue, her face blotched red, but she said nothing. At church, the pew where Ben and Anna used to sit remained conspicuously empty. I heard from a neighbor that when they did attend, the pastor mentioned betrayal within families during his sermon, and Anna left halfway through, her heels clicking on the tile like gunshots. Ben stayed, jaw set, as though daring anyone to meet his eyes. But no one did. They had become pariahs. Their so-called friends drifted away too. Couples who once attended their dinners suddenly had excuses, canceled plans, or simply stopped responding. The lavish parties that had once filled their mountain home with laughter now stood in memory only. Even family distanced themselves. I heard Anna's cousin, who lived 2 towns over, had posted online that, quote, "greed runs deep when you betray your own blood," unquote. That line spread like wildfire, shared and reshared until it was almost a slogan. For me, every story I overheard was a quiet vindication. Not because I enjoyed seeing them humiliated, though I'd be lying if I said it wasn't satisfying, but because it meant the truth was finally louder than the lies. For once, the world saw them for who they really were. Still, revenge is never just about social whispers. Those fade. What lasts is consequence, and I wanted consequence to cling to them like smoke long after the fire burned out. So I deepened the pressure. I filed formal complaints with the state licensing board about Ben's misrepresentation in property deals. I made sure copies of the financial records reached the right hands in the county clerk's office. I knew which bureaucratic cogs to nudge because I had spent years watching people underestimate the quiet woman in the corner. And then something unexpected happened. Anna showed up at one of our sessions alone, her face pale, her hands trembling. She sat down, and for the first time in years, she looked less like the ambitious, cold daughter who had signed me into a ward, and more like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed after a nightmare. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Everything's falling apart. People hate us. Ben blames me. The house doesn't feel like home anymore. It feels cursed." I let her words hang in the air. A part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to remind her I once been her mother before all of this. But the deeper part, the one that remembered cold hospital sheets and the echo of a slamming door, stayed firm. "Anna," I said softly, "sometimes the only way forward is to face the consequences of our actions. Running from them doesn't erase them." She filled with tears. "Do you think I deserve this?" I studied her, weighing every ounce of truth I could afford to give. "I think," I said slowly, "that choices define us, and sometimes the world forces us to live inside the choices we made." She nodded, but her face twisted with guilt or shame, Or maybe anger. I couldn't tell. She left quietly, her footsteps heavy. And I realized then, Anna was breaking in a way Ben never would. He was all defiance, all bluster, all fists against the wall. But Anna's soul was beginning to crack under the weight of what she had done. That night, I sat by the window of my small home, watching the mountain lights flicker from their house. I thought about the little girl I once raised and the woman she had become. For the briefest moment, doubt crept in. Was I destroying her, or was I letting her destroy herself? The line was thin, almost invisible. But then I remembered the ward, the cold white walls, the way she had signed me away as though I were luggage to be stored until inconvenient to her life. The doubt hardened back into resolve. She had chosen her path. I was simply making sure the world saw where it led. And still, the end game wasn't here yet. Their social ruin was satisfying, their financial collapse inevitable, but the true revenge, the kind that would echo for years, required one final stage. A public unmasking so complete that they could never crawl back into the light again. So, I prepared. Quietly. Patiently. The file was ready, the documents lined up, the witnesses willing to testify. All I had to do was wait for the moment that the pressure of their lies crushed them into making a mistake so large that it would finish them. And trust me, they were close. So very close. Tell me, if it were your child, would you stop here? Would you let them learn their lesson and walk away? Or would you keep going, pushing until the very last mask fell? The town was a tinderbox, and it took only the smallest spark to set it ablaze. For Ben, that spark came on a bright Saturday at the farmer's market, a place that used to be the kind of public space where he'd grin and hand out business cards. That morning, someone shouted something about Henderson fraud, and the whispering swelled into an audible jeer. Ben felt it like a physical shove, a climate of contempt he hadn't been prepared for. He marched through the stalls, face flushed, and when someone called him a thief, the blood in his ears roared. I got the call from a neighbor. He's at the market, making a scene. I didn't rush over. Panic and spectacle are different things, and I would not feed his fury with an audience. But word spread. Ben smashed a display table, shoved a man who'd criticized him, and had to be led away by 2 officers before anyone was seriously hurt. The footage, predictably, found its way online within hours. There he was, Ben, no longer the poised businessman, but a man unspooling in public, his temper a live wire. That outburst mattered for reasons beyond pride. It was damning in a courtroom way. The county investigator could now point to a pattern: reckless emotional responses, an inability to manage stress, and behavior consistent with someone making desperate short-term decisions to cover longer-term collapse. The footage became another data point in the file I'd so carefully curated. But as one door slammed, another one creaked open, and through it came panic-driven choices. Anna, who had been crumbling quietly in private, did something I never expected. She tried to fix it the only way she knew how, by bargaining. Not with words, but with paper. One evening, she arrived at my office late, rain dragging from her coat, eyes hollow and frantic. "I can fix this," she said, not waiting for me to speak. "There are documents. Her hands fluttered like a trapped bird. "I can make it look like some of the transfers were mistakes. I can forge signatures, adjust dates, make it look like the bank messed up. We can stall the foreclosure if I get the right paperwork in order." I felt the air leave my lungs. Forgery, perjury, criminal acts, the kind of desperation that drives someone to burn the whole house down to stop the smoke. "Anna," I said slowly, grounding myself in professional distance, "you cannot do that." She looked at me like I'd suggested the moon fall out of the sky. "It's the only way. Ben's losing it. If we don't stop this now, everything is gone. Do you understand? Everything." Panic made her words jagged. There are moments in this work when you see a person stand at the edge of a cliff, and the choice they make is either to climb back or to jump. I had trained myself to be the hand that pulls people from that edge, not the cheer that nudges them forward. If you do that, I said slowly, you'll be playing their game at the cost of your soul. Besides, the law will find out. Forgeries leave fingerprints, patterns. And if you get caught, it will be worse than losing a house. You could go to prison. Her shoulders sagged, as if the weight had been put back on her. For a second, I glimpsed the child who'd once begged me not to leave for her first day of school. Then something cold and reactive flared in her eyes. Maybe prison is better than being the woman who betrayed her mother, she spat. The words cut deeper than I expected. I left the session with 1,000 new calculations. Anna's impulse to commit fraud was both my nightmare and an opportunity. Desperation breeds mistakes, and mistakes make stories public and prosecutable. My task now was to steer fate so that her instinct to cover up would either be undone or be witnessed before any legal misstep could be made. I had to prevent her from burning the bridge and, if possible, force her hand into admitting truth instead. But the world is rarely so obedient. A week later, the defense attorney launched a scorched earth strategy. They sought to discredit me publicly, alleging that I had manipulated sessions, coaxed admissions, and used my position to orchestrate a vendetta. A smear campaign flickered into life. Anonymous posts, whispers at the hairdresser, a rumor that the crazy woman is back and she's after her own family. The threshold of public sympathy dropped. Even some who'd been supportive of the investigation suddenly wondered if justice risked turning into revenge. I felt the first cold drop of fear then. Real. Rational. My license, the one I'd fought so hard to earn, could be threatened. I could be accused of ethical breaches. If the licensing board opened an inquiry into my conduct, everything I'd built would come crashing down. My hands reflexively went to the file in my bag, the paper fortress that proved the truth. But paper can be dismissed as bias if the messenger is compromised. So, I pivoted. I reached out to Dana, the reporter, not as a conspirator, but as a steward of truth. You need to be careful, I told her, giving her access to the raw documents she'd asked for with clear provenance and dates, notarized records where possible. She listened, nodded, and promised diligence. I also scheduled a private meeting with the county investigator, laying out exactly what I had and offering to cooperate fully if he wanted to subpoena my session notes within legal bounds. Transparency would be my shield. If the law could scrutinize my methods and still find the facts intact, the smear campaign would dry up like ink under the sunlight. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. At a small hearing to determine interim control over the property, Anna froze. Under oath, with the town watching and cameras waiting, she was asked about specific transfers and loans. Ben's earlier outbursts were played back on a screen. The prosecutor's questions were precise, unblinking. And for a sliver of a second, Anna's eyes lifted and met mine across the room. There was a storm there. Fear, regret, and something like pleading. I didn't know, she began, voice quivering. I thought Ben handled everything. I trusted him. It wasn't a dramatic confession, but it was a fissure. Under pressure, small cracks become canyons. The more she said, the more it became clear that she had not been the mastermind, but she had been complicit, willfully blind when it suited her. The legal gears turned faster. Still, it wasn't a clean victory. The defense filed motions to disqualify my testimony, painted me as biased, and demanded my record sealed. The licensing board opened a preliminary look into whether my dual role as a mother and court-appointed therapist represented a conflict of interest, exactly the kind of accusation they'd hoped would tie my hands. I faced a crossroads: defend myself fiercely and risk looking vindictive, or step back and let the law continue, hoping the truth would stand on its own. I chose both. I let the investigators and Dana examine everything. I kept my tone professional in court. I refused to engage publicly with the smear, because I had learned that furious reactions make better headlines than quiet facts.
By the time the hearing adjourned that day, the town's mood had shifted again. There was not exultation so much as a tired, sharp relief, like people watching a long nightmare finally begin to dissolve. But the war was not yet over. There would be more hearings, more motions, more desperate attempts to rewrite the record. And Anna, oh Anna, had to decide whether to bear witness to truth and begin the slow, painful work of atonement, or to commit the kind of desperate sins that would bury her deeper than any foreclosure could. If you were standing where I was, watching your daughter tremble under oath, would you push her to tell the truth, no matter how much it would hurt you both? Or would you stay silent to protect whatever few shreds of family remained? Because I had to choose, and my choice would shape the final act. The last hearing wasn't supposed to be explosive. It was meant to be procedural, a chance to finalize the foreclosure, address fraud claims, and begin the slow grind of restitution. But when pride is on trial, the quietest days can become battlefields. Ben arrived first, jaw tight, wearing the same navy suit he had worn to every appearance, though this one fit looser now. His weight had slipped off in the months of stress, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. Anna came later, shoulders hunched, looking older than her years, her hands clasped as though in prayer. I sat behind the counsel table with the investigators' team, my file resting on my lap like a loaded weapon I no longer needed to fire. The judge asked for final statements. The prosecutor laid out the case in stark, undeniable detail. Forged documents attempted, property transfers done without disclosure, violent outbursts, coercion, years of calculated deceit. The paper trail told the story in black and white. Then Ben spoke. Or rather, he tried. His voice was low at first, defensive, but as the questions sharpened, he rose in volume until it was almost a roar. "This is all lies. He stabbed his finger towards me. My wife, my daughter, they're victims of her manipulation. She's twisted everything. She's obsessed with revenge."
His voice cracked. The judge's gavel struck hard. Murmurs filled the courtroom. And then, like a thread finally snapping, Anna stood. She didn't look at me. She didn't even look at Ben. Her words tumbled out, shaking but clear. "It's true," she said. The silence after was heavy enough to crush stone. We signed her into the ward. I signed her in. I told myself it was for her own good, but it wasn't. It was for us. We wanted the house. We told ourselves she was unstable and maybe she was grieving, but we lied. We lied to keep her away. We lied to keep the property. And Ben kept it going because he knew if she came back, she'd take it all. Ben spun toward her, his face blotched red, veins pulsing at his temples. "Shut up, Anna. Don't you dare." He lunged as though words alone could throttle her confession. 2 bailiffs moved quickly, pinning him back. And in that chaos, the last of their masks fell. The judge's voice cut through the din, measured but sharp as steel. "Order. Enough. The record will reflect the admissions made today." Her eyes softened only briefly when they flicked to me, before turning back to the defendants with undisguised disdain. "This court finds evidence of willful deceit, fraud, and coercion. Restitution will be pursued to the full extent. Foreclosure is approved. Custodianship of the property is awarded back to Mary Henderson." My name, spoken in that room like the return of a title long stolen. Ben slumped in his chair, shoulders shaking with fury he could no longer wield. Anna wept quietly, the tears carving lines down her pale face. I didn't feel triumph then. Not exactly. I felt something colder, heavier. Justice isn't joy. It's balance restored after years of imbalance. It's the pendulum swinging back, cutting cleanly through the lies. When I walked out of that courthouse, the mountain air hit me like a baptism. For the first time since my husband died, I felt the weight of my home settle back into my bones. It was mine again. Not just the land, not just the walls, but the dignity they'd tried to strip away. Neighbors stopped me in the street, some with hugs, some with quiet nods of solidarity. I accepted them all, but I didn't revel in them, because I knew what they didn't. Revenge isn't just about winning, it's about what's left of you when the battle is done. That night, I sat on the porch of my mountain home. The house was scarred from years of their occupancy. Scratches in the wood, mismatched paint, a cracked pane of glass, but it was alive again. It breathed with me. I poured a cup of tea, let the steam rise into the cool air, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to exhale without fear. But peace isn't simple. Anna's words in court replayed in my mind. The admission, the cracks in her armor, the way her voice broke like glass. She had betrayed me, yes. She had condemned me to sterile halls and sleepless nights in a psych ward. But she had also been a daughter once. My daughter. And that truth gnawed at me even in victory. I wondered, did I destroy her or did she destroy herself? Was I a mother reclaiming justice or a woman feeding the fire until nothing was left of family but ash? I don't know if I'll ever have that answer, but I know this. I survived, I rebuilt, and I made sure that those who tried to silence me were forced to speak their sins aloud for the world to hear. So let me ask you, if it were your child, your flesh and blood, would you have done the same? Would you have waited years to strike, building your revenge brick by brick? Or would you have let it go for the sake of peace? Be honest with me, because peace, I've learned, is not the absence of war. Sometimes peace is what you win only after the last battle has been fought. And mine is finally here.